20 years down the line, the National Liberation Front fighters would drag their own neighbors out of their homes and slaughter them. Yet back in the late 19th century, millions of desperate peasants looked up to these future executioners as their only real saviors. The French colonized Vietnam, tying it together with Laos and Cambodia to form French Indochina. By the time the Second World War kicked off, the population of this territory had swelled to over 20 million people. Men stood knee-deep in the rice paddies, breathing in the thick smell of wet mud, only to hand over almost their entire harvest to a colonial official. Wealthy French and local elites grabbed the best land. Forced labor and absurdly high taxes crushed the rest of the population. Those beaten-down farmers would soon grab rifles and flood the entire country with blood. Hunger and sheer desperation stripped away any other options. The people finally started searching for a way to fight back. The villages demanded a leader, and in 1941, Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh for an open war. The 17th parallel sliced Vietnam in half, but this map division started with raw peasant rage. He took men armed with simple tools and forged a disciplined force. He had studied revolutionary tactics in Moscow. Now, he directed the hatred of the poor straight at the French troops. The jungle became their shield. By 1945, the resistance had grown massive. When Japan surrendered, Ho Chi Minh declared independence. France refused to drop the colony. Commanders sent troops to reclaim the land, sparking the First Indochina War. The fighting dragged on through sudden ambushes. French patrols stumbled blindly against fighters who knew every hidden path. The conflict peaked at Dien Bien Phu. Around 50,000 Viet Minh soldiers surrounded the French base. The artillery siege lasted 56 days under General Vo Nguyen Giap. The peasant army broke the colonial troops. Defeated, Paris agreed to pull its forces out of Indochina. Global powers gathered at the Geneva Conference in 1954 to negotiate. The agreement temporarily divided the country. Ho Chi Minh and his communist government took the north. They set up their headquarters in Hanoi. Emperor Bao Dai took control of the south. That royal control did not last. By 1955, Ngo Dinh Diem sat in the presidential palace and single-handedly canceled the nationwide elections. He knew Ho Chi Minh had the popular vote locked down. Diem refused the 1956 reunification vote. He turned the police against his own citizens. Boots pounded the pavement during midnight raids across Saigon. The police did not just hunt communists or Buddhist monks. They threw peasants in jail simply for complaining about high taxes. The rural regions boiled over. Villagers saw the new regime as worse than the French colonizers. The government favored wealthy landowners while bleeding the poor dry. By 1960, execution squads operated in the open. They hunted suspected Viet Minh sympathizers without trial. Diem thought he was securing his power. In reality, his corruption pushed the countryside straight into communist hands. People stopped tolerating it. In 1960, angry peasants received their first real weapon shipments straight through the Laotian jungle. Yesterday, these rebels carried homemade pikes. Now they transformed into a regular striking force. Officially, the newly formed National Liberation Front, or Vietcong, claimed to be an independent militia of local civilians. In reality, Hanoi directed their every move. The mechanics of this proxy war relied entirely on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Porters hauled heavy crates through a hidden network of paths cutting across Laos and Cambodia. The combined length of these supply routes exceeded 16,000 kilometers. North Vietnam pumped constant supplies into the south. The Viet Cong used this pipeline to mount coordinated bombings, assassinate officials, and ambush military patrols. They no longer relied on scavenged gear. Thousands of rifles crossed the border every month. Those newly supplied rifles allowed the Viet Cong to enforce their own order across remote territories by the mid-1960s. Armed squads dragged school teachers right out of their homes in the dead of night. Between 1957 and 1972, they assassinated between 36,000 and 50,000 civilians. South Vietnam held a population of roughly 16 million people. The fighters demanded total control over the rural masses. To rule the villages, they had to eliminate the established local authority. Hitmen hunted down village chiefs, government clerks, and police officers. Without these specific leaders, the Saigon administration quickly lost its grip on the countryside. A heavy knock on a wooden door usually meant a quick death sentence. Guerrillas pulled the local chief out into the dark dirt street. They executed him right in front of the watching neighbors. After the echoing gunshots faded, an absolute silence settled over the village. Fear replaced propaganda. The liberators realized that public executions guaranteed compliance. The Vietcong shifted their operations from targeted political hits to widespread mass terror across the entire South. Mass terror needed an audience to actually work. Peasants stood in the dust, forced to watch their own neighbor being buried alive. To keep their grip on rural areas, the Viet Cong turned cruelty into a localized spectacle. They dragged out anyone connected to the South or the Americans. Executioners used ropes, guns, or simply shovels. People had to keep their eyes open. If they looked away, they risked joining the victims in the dirt. The warning did not end when the screaming stopped. Cadres dumped the dead bodies on market stalls and left them rotting on roadsides for days. It was a carefully managed performance. Soon, the violence expanded into pure class warfare. Guerrillas hunted down wealthy individuals and local landowners. They stripped these families of their property and redistributed the stolen fields to poor farmers. The revolution promised sudden equality, but confiscating the homes and land plunged the surviving villagers into total chaos and suffering. The intimidation tactics shifted from single executions on village squares directly into mass destruction. 250 bodies of women and children lay in the ashes. On December 5, 1967, a force of 600 Viet Cong fighters surrounded the Doc Sun settlement. The target was the Montagnard tribe, an ethnic minority holding land in the Central Highlands. This mountainous region anchored the massive Ho Chi Minh Trail network, making control over the local indigenous population a major military advantage for moving weapons south. The attackers moved in quietly while the families slept. Jets of liquid fire from military flamethrowers slammed into the dry straw roofs. The heavy smell of burning reed and charring human flesh quickly choked the humid night air. Families woke up surrounded by flames and frantically tried to sprint out into the open dirt streets. Viet Cong shooters simply waited in the dark shadows and gunned them down as they bolted from their blazing doorways. 250 women, children, and elderly villagers burned alive. By morning, thousands of surviving Montagnards abandoned their ancestral lands and fled straight into crowded refugee camps. Those who survived the village purges disappeared under the dense foliage. The Viet Cong built no official prisons. The jungle itself became the holding cell. Captives expected stone walls. They found only the sweltering heat and sharpened punji stakes hidden beneath the thick undergrowth. To dodge American reconnaissance flights, these hidden camps constantly shifted coordinates. They moved every week. Guerrillas relocated these camps across South Vietnam, pushed into Cambodia, and hid deep inside the borders of Laos. Captured South Vietnamese soldiers, local officials, and American prisoners of war marched barefoot through the deep mud. Guards starved them daily. Interrogators kept men alive just to extract tactical intelligence. Prisoners who refused to speak caught a bullet. Escape was nearly impossible. Inside these camps without walls, they broke bodies. How do you break a man without complex tools? You lock him in a bamboo tiger cage under the tropical sun. Guards shoved the captive inside the metal or bamboo frame. The crude door slammed shut. He could neither stand up straight nor stretch his legs. Above him, the blazing sky offered zero protection. Summer temperatures in the Vietnamese jungle exceed 35 degrees Celsius at 100% humidity. The heat cooked men alive in those cramped, unnatural positions. Skin blistered and peeled off in long strips. Insects swarmed the open wounds and fed on the fresh blisters. Deep infections and heat exhaustion set in within days. Then the captors changed their approach. Guards forced men into tight wooden or metal boxes. Inside these solid crates, a prisoner could not sit up. He could not lie down flat. Guards sealed the heavy lid shut. Captives fought for every breath in the pitch dark. Interrogators relied on simple, blunt force. They swung rifle butts and thick bamboo sticks directly at knees, ribs, and spines. Bones cracked under repeated strikes until the captive could barely move. For water torture, guards held a man down and poured liters of dirty liquid straight into his nose and throat. Every desperate intake of air triggered the violent physical sensation of drowning. Yet the worst technique required only a basic rope and a strong tree branch. A prisoner hung suspended by his feet for 12 straight hours. The guerrillas threw American officers into the exact same bamboo cages alongside the local peasants. Lieutenant James Rowe spent exactly 5 years locked inside this tropical hell. The captors did not see their prisoners as human beings. They viewed them strictly as symbols of foreign imperialism. While the regular army ran the massive Ho Lo prison in Hanoi, these southern camps focused on starvation. Captured in 1963, Rowe endured forced marches under a blinding sun that burned his skin. Guards dragged him through dense thickets, deliberately breaking down his body. He suffered through severe malnutrition and diseases during those grueling months. Rowe tried to break free, but the guerrillas always caught him. It took 5 long years before he found a real opening. In 1968, the exhausted lieutenant killed a guard to secure his freedom. He sprinted through the thick jungle underbrush, waving his arms until a passing American helicopter spotted him. After returning home, Rowe used his ordeal to build the military survival training program known as SERE. He taught future generations of soldiers how to endure enemy captivity. Meanwhile, other men faced a different fate. Their guards forced them to record fake propaganda videos on camera. Vietcong fighters kicked down wooden doors. Heavy boots shattered the quiet of the Lunar New Year feast. The nightmare of the jungle camps finally spilled onto the paved streets of Hue. Armed men walked straight into civilian dining rooms. A squad leader pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He read the names aloud, checking them against the faces of terrified residents. They took the entire family away. This was January 30th, 1968, the start of the Tet Offensive. Around 80,000 communist troops launched coordinated attacks across the country. Over 100 cities and military bases came under fire at the exact same moment. The ancient capital of Hue became the center of the storm. North Vietnamese troops quickly overran the northern half of the city. They captured the historic citadel. As soon as the army secured the streets, political cadres went to work. They did not shoot randomly. They executed a cold, pre-planned purge. Death squads moved block by block, using pre-compiled hit lists. They hunted down South Vietnamese government clerks, military officers, and local police. But the net caught much more. Executioners dragged teachers, doctors, and religious leaders directly from their homes. Anyone holding a higher education or local influence became a primary target. Neutrality meant nothing. If your name appeared on that paper, you vanished. The urban battle raged for weeks. On February 24, 1968, the gunfire finally ceased. U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese troops recaptured the heavily damaged city. Together, they began searching the rubble for the thousands of missing citizens. By February 24th, the guns went quiet, and the rescue teams followed the trail of the disappeared straight to freshly turned earth. Up to 6,000 dead. Final counts placed the victims between 2,800 and 6,000. The massive burial sites forced soldiers to bring in heavy machinery. Yellow bulldozers pushed away the dirt, exposing long trenches filled with human remains. Men wearing masks climbed into the pits to pull the bodies out. The heat had accelerated decomposition over the past month. Grieving relatives stood by the open graves. They identified their husbands and daughters solely by torn pieces of fabric on their shirts. Before the offensive, Hue held about 140,000 people. The executions wiped out a significant part of its educated class. The Viet Cong claimed they only targeted traitors, but the trenches proved otherwise. Searchers uncovered over 300 bodies near Da Mai Creek. They found hundreds more buried in the schoolyard at Gia Hoi High School. The executioners eliminated anyone they considered a threat, sorting people by their beliefs. Buddhist monks and Catholic priests were shot for practicing their faith. Intellectuals died because insurgents viewed education as a Western influence. Whole families disappeared during the raids, and the firing squads made no exceptions for the youngest residents. Armed men killed boys and girls alongside their mothers, pushing them into the same shallow pits. Sometimes the patrols only took the adults away. Those children, whose parents had been executed, remained at their empty houses to slowly starve to death. But starvation was not the only fate for the orphans of Hue. The surviving teenagers became the raw material for the next phase of the war. A 12-year-old boy stood crying in the dark. A guerrilla shoved a rifle into his hands. Night raids targeted villages across the region. Parents hid their sons under floorboards, but the search parties always found them. Guerrillas dragged boys as young as 12 or 13 from their homes. They marched away into the dense jungle. Here, the psychological breaking began. The jungle completely isolated the children. They had no food and no contact with their families. Instructors told them they were the only defense against the Americans. If a boy refused to hold a weapon, the punishment was immediate. Instructors beat him. They starved him for days. Sometimes, the boy had to watch older guerrillas shoot another child. Fear quickly replaced resistance, and the training moved fast. The instructors handed out AK-47 assault rifles. A fully loaded AK-47 with a 30-round magazine weighs about 4.3 kilograms. That is a heavy burden for a malnourished 12-year-old. The boys learned to strip the weapons blindfolded. They set booby traps along the dirt roads. They planted landmines where American and South Vietnamese patrols walked. Then came the final test of loyalty. The instructors brought out captured South Vietnamese soldiers. They forced the children to step forward. The boys had to execute the prisoners. They pulled the triggers on men they did not know. The shooting proved they belonged to the unit. Most of these kids never saw their parents again. Many died in sudden firefights. They caught bullets in battles they barely understood. The instructors simply gathered the survivors. They led the remaining children deeper into the jungle for the next fight. An AK-47 in a teenager's hands was not the worst threat hiding out in the jungle. A small child walked slowly toward the heavy sandbag gates of an American checkpoint near Da Nang. You hear a lost kid crying loudly in the dirt. Sentries see a frightened boy desperately needing a medic. But under his dirty clothes, someone strapped 5 pounds of C4 explosives. The blast instantly killed the child and the soldiers trying to save him. Guerrillas needed bodies to keep this strategy alive. If families hid their kids, armed patrols visited the village elders. They demanded young boys and girls as a mandatory tax for the war effort. Refusal meant the entire settlement burned to the ground by morning. Sometimes, the Vietcong executed mothers and fathers right in the dirt streets. With no home and no family remaining, these new orphans had no choice but to follow the exact same people who pulled the trigger. The guerrillas pushed these traumatized captives far beyond the military bases, forcing them down remote dirt trails. One ordinary tin can. A peasant took a nervous step forward through the thick and humid undergrowth. His ankle caught a fishing line, pulling the pin from a grenade concealed inside that rusty metal container. The sudden explosion tore through the trees, leaving the man bleeding out on the damp forest floor. If the captives managed to avoid the tripwires, they faced sharpened bamboo punji stakes hidden inside shallow pits. The fighters coated these wooden spikes with human feces to guarantee a slow and agonizing infection. This method caused such horrific suffering that the United Nations officially banned these primitive traps under the 1980 convention. Every step for a local villager walking through the brush carried the very real threat of a sudden end. The Viet Cong intentionally mixed with the population, turning entire communities into unwilling protective barriers during firefights. American troops found it almost impossible to shoot back without hitting the innocent people standing in their line of sight. But the nightmare went far beyond just hiding behind terrified women and children during a sudden ambush. Commanders regularly forced unarmed villagers to walk directly across known minefields in front of their advancing troops. These regular farmers essentially cleared the explosive path by stepping on the hidden charges themselves. Refusers were simply shot. Nobody was left to avenge those executed farmers. Back in 1975, communist forces seized the streets of Saigon. Today, state history books erase the mass graves of Hue. The victors write the rules. The capital's collapse triggered a massive exodus. Over 800,000 refugees fled on boats across the following years. Survivors trapped inside the country learned to stay silent. The new government officially crowned the guerrillas as national heroes. Medals washed the blood away. The Vietcong formally integrated right into the regular People's Army of Vietnam.